Our natural urge as human beings is to seek a more complete understanding of the way the world works. We can never be content with a simple or incomplete explanation, or to allow certain phenomena to just go unexplained. There's much to be gained from conquering the unknowable, and the proof of efficacy in our rational and inquisitive human system stands for itself. But as we plow through the number of unanswered questions the world presents on the backs of science and technology, we are increasingly forced to confront those problems which cannot be resolved through traditional methods. In Buddhism, it is common practice for monks to exercise their skills of acceptance and humility with koans, logic puzzles that lack any apparent answer or explanation. Think. Two hands clap and there is a sound. What is the sound of one hand? It's a question that appears to lack an answer, at least within the limits of what we're capable of conceiving. Why even seek to ask that which we can never know the answer to? The goal in working through these puzzles is not to find a solution and claim mental prowess. It is to learn to live with the discomfort of being unable to know at all, and accept that we can't necessarily be masters of everything that exists in nature. Science today finds itself confronted by its own koan, the problem of consciousness, or as it is known today in the field, the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experience of the mind.
And hard it is indeed. Consciousness is, in a sense, the most real experience that any of us are capable of having. It defines the narrative that exists within our minds, our memories, and desires. It is the experience of and the meaning of being you. But for something that is so central to human life, it also proves impossible to resolve, at least within the limits of the problem-solving heuristics we've relied on so far. Consciousness has long been a question for humankind. The real fight began in and around the 17th century, with Descartes defining thought as everything that is within us in such a way that we are immediately aware. By naming consciousness as an entity to be studied, specifically in an environment where science and proof of existence were becoming increasingly valuable tools, the attempt began to understand consciousness from an objective standpoint. In this history, we can chart a progress on how human thought has evolved from the time of the ancients to the moderns. In the past, when we lacked the technology and the system of reasoning required to understand the true nature of how the phenomena we observed worked, we relied on our best assumptions and made more of a space for things like spiritualism and the mystics. The gap between the reality we could observe and control and that which was made by a force beyond our understanding was wide and more forgiving. The Enlightenment and our subsequent turn to the scientific method and reductionism changed that. We began to find that relying on a carefully controlled method of reasoning and experimentation revealed to us truths about reality that we had previously deemed unreachable. It's no surprise that among the prevailing theories that has emerged from this success is that of scientific materialism. The idea that reality is entirely physical and can be eventually completely understood as a set of logical processes. In a survey of biological scientists conducted in 1998, over 92.5% reported strong disbelief in the existence of personal immortality, or a consciousness that it persists after death. The issue with sticking to materialism as the sole answer to unpuzzling the world's mysteries is that there's one major objection to its accuracy as a theory that we can't seem to be able to overcome, and that is the presence of the conscious mind. We just can't decipher how physical objects and processes, in terms of neuronal collisions and electrical signaling, culminate in the experience that is conscious thought. The question becomes, is our inability to understand simply because the science has not gotten there yet, or because there's a force at play beyond what we have been willing to consider? For some time, neuroscience wasn't even considered a question meant for philosophy. Philosopher John Searle tells a funny story about it.
And when I first got interested in this, I thought, well, consciousness, it's a biological problem. So I went over to the University of California, San Francisco, where they have a big neurobiology gang. And I said, why don't you guys get busy and solve the problem of consciousness? How does the brain do it? What am I paying you to do? And the answer was very revealing. The answer was, look, it's not science. Maybe it's okay for philosophers and theologians to talk about consciousness, but serious scientists do not talk about consciousness. And one guy, quite a famous brain stabber, said to me, look, in my discipline, It's okay to talk about consciousness, but get tenure first.
One of the central problems in the neuroscience of consciousness is understanding how objective matter can produce a subjective experience. This challenge is referred to broadly as the mind-body problem, an investigation of the relationship between conscious experience and the physical processes of the brain. Our brains are matter, and the neurons and webs of glial cells which fire within them are mere matter as well. If materialism holds true, then the brain alone is sufficient to produce consciousness, and neuroscientists are charged with understanding exactly what the physical instruments involved are. This is where the idea of neuronal correlates of consciousness lie. They define the simplest set of cellular and molecular processes that are sufficient to produce a perceptual experience. For example, if we wanted to find the neural correlates for the experience of seeing a face, we would record which parts of the brain are active and which neurons fire when a person sees a face, imagines a face, or dreams of a face, barring that other mental activities are also occurring. Neuroscientists study these correlates empirically, using techniques to measure neuronal states and brain activity, and corresponding those states to the experiences described by the individual under study. Consciousness is hard to study through traditional scientific methods because it's private. But it's possible to begin research from the point of recording certain behaviors or perceptive experiences within a subject and corresponding them to specific neural activities going on in that subject's brain. This is what we would call the behavioral correlates of consciousness. Neuroscientists use a variety of sophisticated methods to measure brain activity, but the two most popular in the field at the moment are fMRIs and EEGs. Have you ever seen a scan of the brain with different regions lit up in color? That would be an fMRI, or a functional MRI, which measures the blood flow to specific brain regions while an individual is undergoing a certain physical or emotional experience. You're probably also familiar with the image of a test subject fixed with a cap plugged into a host of wires. What's taking place there is an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. The brain's neurons communicate through the generation and transmission of electrical charges, or action potentials. EEGs record the summed activity of thousands or millions of neurons to track how brain activity is changing in the duration of or in response to a given event. The current science on charting the neural activity underlying consciousness begins with neuroanatomy. It's important to recognize that bigger is not necessarily better when it comes to finding neural correlates. Brain regions that are complex and enmeshed in many other parts of the neuroanatomy often have no recorded significance to consciousness. The cerebellum has 4 times the neurons of the cortex, is connected intimately to other brain regions, and yet lesions to that region have little impact for consciousness. It's believed that the regions of the brain most likely to be neural correlates are located in the posterior cerebral cortex, in a specific hot zone within the temporoparietal occipital region. The activity of neuronal clusters in the brainstem, hypothalamus, and basal forebrain are also thought to be necessary and sufficient for consciousness to arise. Recent research reveals that specific cells of the cortex may also be related to distinctive parts of consciousness. There are these large, thick-tufted pyramidal neurons, which are able to rely on their broad apical tufts to receive high levels of feedback from both local and long distances. There are also supragranular pyramidal cells, which can precisely deliver projections of messaging in both the forward and backward directions. One of the first findings in the field of biological consciousness, which continues to be of particular interest today, is that of gamma synchronization. It's a proposal that consciousness requires that entire populations of neurons be synchronized and firing, much like an orchestra of active potentials in particular brain regions. Increasingly sophisticated methods and progress in the field has brought us closer than ever before to understanding what underlies consciousness at the physiological level. But the issue becomes that even if we were able to discover and characterize the neural correlates that produce the perceptive experiences of the mind, we just can't understand how they result in the experience of being you. Think of your brain activity like marbles on a plate. We may understand that the collision and interaction of these marbles in a specific pattern is sufficient to allow for the sensing of light or feeling of loss, but it doesn't explain how that mass of marbles becomes alive in the way that we mean it. At what point does matter become mind? I mean, if you think about it, lots of other processes in the body are also the result of a discrete set of physical functions. Your stomach digesting, your bone marrow producing blood cells. But all of these processes occur in what philosopher David Chalmers calls the dark. They don't result in any sort of conscious experience. So what is it that sets cellular and molecular and chemical processes that occur in the brain apart from any other thing that we've managed to study in nature? So what we do know at this point is that the current findings of neuroscience are insufficient to explain what produces conscious experience. There are several explanations which follow from that. A, we're just limited by our technology and reasoning, but it'll eventually be possible to discover what creates the conscious mind solely through a physical lens. Or B, consciousness just can't be fully explained by science or through physical conception of reality, meaning there's a gap between what humans are able to access regarding how certain parts of the universe operate and what the true functionalities are. If B is true, the consequences are upending. Room returns in our lives for a mysticism and ambiguity thought long conquered since the days of the Enlightenment. Doubt and chance, those unnerving variables that are frustrating to live with, enter back into the equation. We are unable to tie the problem into a neat loop, perhaps indefinitely. That is why, particularly for this subject, it's necessary for other disciplines to come into the conversation.
Philosophy is seen today as worlds apart from the more materially inclined natural sciences. It says much about how dismissive we've become to any mode of knowledge that isn't directly tied to quantitative results. Philosophy is in fact the oldest of any of the disciplines aiming to offer more clarity about a murky reality. It began as a systematization of the most natural of human behaviors, curiosity about the world, and a desire to resolve that curiosity through logical explanations. Philosophy is based always in reason, and typically follows a rigorous process of logic and analysis to propose explanations regarding how some of the ambiguous phenomena we observe in the day-to-day work. It's much more than sitting on a rock thinking about the universe. Even if that's where it began, philosophy is the branching point for biology, physics, psychology, and every other subject that comes more readily to the mind when thinking about practical solutions to a problem like this one.
I spoke to Dr. Preddy, professor of philosophy at the College of New Jersey, to get a philosopher's take on how to approach the seemingly insurmountable challenge of defining something that can't exactly be bottled up to study.
What would that look like? So first of all, you'd have to have cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to have an open mind. Okay, so the neurobiologist can't just be like rolling their eyes and saying, oh, come on, it's all neurobiology. It's all synapses. The theologians might have to not be so convinced that we're talking about supernatural, afterlife-y things.
Yeah, like spiritual. Yeah.
I mean, why not? But on the other hand, and then the philosophers would have to be very clear about the variety of ways in which we can maybe make ourselves understood, particularly by the neurobiologists, but also by theologians. So,
to chart a brief history of thoughts on consciousness through philosophical time, we start with Descartes of I think, therefore I am fame. Descartes was a proponent of mind-body dualism, arguing that the conscious mind and the physical body which hosts it are two entirely separate entities. The resulting system looks something like this. Whereas input is detected and imported by means of the faculties of the body, the force making sense of sensory input and experiencing any feeling or emotion in response to it is the immaterial consciousness. Descartes thought that consciousness was somewhat akin to a soul, a non-physical form of identity which was capable of existing outside of the constraints of material body, but governed by rules outside of those that define matter. But many philosophers and neuroscientists have disavowed this theory as leaving too much to doubt and resting in its incompleteness. David Chalmers, mentioned earlier as a leading figure in the current philosophical debate on consciousness, addressed the issue present in the mind-body problem by breaking the discussion over consciousness into two parts, the hard and the easy problem. To understand the difference between the two, consider a thought experiment known as Mary's Room, first proposed by philosopher Frank Jackson. Mary is a young woman who was raised in an enclosed room set only in black and white, made to learn about the world through a black and white television screen. She's an excellent neuroscientist and has devoted her life to studying the neurophysiology of vision. She spent years acquiring and mastering all of the conceptual knowledge which explains how a human perceives of color. She knows about the electromagnetic spectrum and how light is transmitted through space and waves. She knows about pigments and the reflection and absorption of different light frequencies. She knows about the cones and rods of the eyes and how frequencies of light interact with detectors in the human body, how the neurons of the visual cortex respond to stimulation to produce the sensation of color. So now, if Mary were taken one day out of her room, and into the world of color, and made to see a red apple or the blue sky for the first time. Would she learn anything new? Assuming that Mary has understood everything there is to about the mental states preceding the experience of color, is there any change in her understanding of what it means to see color when she is first allowed to do it for herself? If the answer is no, and that Mary could have understood what it means to see the color red simply by studying the neural processes underlying it, then a completely physical model of the world holds true. But if you think there is something Mary learned in seeing the color red for herself that she could not have known by reading about the processes which define it alone, then there is something that exists in experience outside of the physical alone. So for David Chalmers, the easy problem will refer to everything that Mary studies while she is still inside the room. This would involve explaining how the physical processes of the mind produce certain cognitive experiences, such as determining the specific pathway of neural firing associated with the sensing of emotion. The hard problem is judging why these processes produce consciousness, or any specific state of feeling and internal awareness at all.
What's especially frustrating about the hard problem is that it appears, at least for now, to be outside of our reach. The field of cognitive science involves input from experts across a range of disciplines. Just look at the Rutgers Cognitive Science faculty page for an example. And yet, the hard problem seems to suggest that there is something to consciousness beyond what our tools of investigation can penetrate. David Chalmers addresses this insufficiency with the idea of the extra ingredient. We have seen that there are systematic reasons why the usual methods of cognitive science and neuroscience fail to account for conscious experience. These are simply the wrong sort of methods. Nothing that they give us can yield an explanation. To account for conscious experience, we need an extra ingredient in explanation.
The dead-end nature of the consciousness question calls back into mind the same objections that one may raise to the Buddhist koan. Is it worth concentrating our time and effort on a question with an answer purported to be outside of our human reach? Advances in an understanding of human physiology have always corresponded to improvements in medicinal care. If we are able to better understand what underwrites the conscious experience at the level of neurobiology, physicians will be better equipped to treat patients with traumas and illnesses deteriorating their cognitive functions. Consciousness is perhaps most pertinent to the questions facing the modern age when it comes to the AI revolution, the next natural turn in the advancement of human technology. If consciousness is in fact entirely physical, that would suggest it can one day be constructed artificially, provided that a complete mapping has been achieved and the parts necessary are available. There are a host of ethical and cautionary considerations that come with that. What will the distinctions be between artificial life and organically occurring human beings? What are the moral obligations we have to artificially constructed consciousness? Will these machines eventually become a threat to our own safety as a human race? The AI revolution is already here, and you would be irresponsible to ignore the question that lies at the heart of it. Is consciousness something humans are capable of mastering? Beyond these practical concerns, studying consciousness prompts ideological challenges that are useful for us to learn from. Firstly, the realization that science has its own limits and is not a tool yet equipped to resolve every question posed by reality is useful in opening the door to more interdisciplinary perspectives. And while it is comforting to think that we cannot completely define what it is that makes us human, it adds room for gratitude we would otherwise be blind to. It is easier to appreciate that which we cannot completely explain, because there is a power in being outside the scope of human interference and investigation. The invincibility of consciousness to being picked apart is somewhat appealing. It suggests that there is something special about the case of being a conscious human being that deserves to be valued.